I should introduce, as Namely dig a little bit further, our panellists today. To my immediate left is Ben Robertson, who's a UK government critical minerals lead in Australia. Next to Ben is Dr. Rachael Morgan, Australian at Geoscience Australia, Australia Critical Minerals Research and Development Hub leader. And from the US Embassy in Canberra is Michael Sullivan, Economic Counsellor at the Embassy and a regular visitor to our Battery Minerals Conference. Thank you for joining us today. I've got some other questions, but I really wanted to take up some of the points that we've heard already this morning. And to Maria's point just recently, and also to Ambassador Kennedy's point, Michael, I'll start with you. It feels like there's a recognition across the globe that, particularly in the last 12 months, that no one country can go it alone in diversifying and securing their supply chains. Are we starting to see that recognition in policy settings in the US and elsewhere, for that matter?
First off, thank you, Dominic, for inviting me back again. This is the second year in a row that I've been here, and it's always a really interesting conversation with industry. To answer your question, short answer, yes, definitely. As Ambassador Kennedy mentioned, last year we launched the Compact for Climate, Clean Energy, and Critical Minerals at the occasion of the state visit Prime Minister Albanese in Washington. That is really kind of codifying the work that we've been doing with Australia to advance cooperation in the industry. We're looking at now getting into really tangible outputs for this compact. One of the things, again, that the ambassador kind of references, we're trying to get the director of the US Export-Import Bank out here in a few months, because we think it'd be really important for her to speak directly with industry. We already have a lot of cooperation between Export Finance Australia and Exim Bank. We're actually looking at a very short list of projects that we would do some government co-financing to send a really strong indicator to industry about how serious our two governments are. And then I think on the other side, again, the change in legislation that allows both Australia and the UK to be considered domestic sources of production under Title III of the Defence Production Act is really signifies how important we're taking the issue of critical minerals for our national security ecosystem. And we're trying to, well, we're not trying, we will get the Assistant Secretary for Defense Industrial Production, Taylor Kale, to come out here in probably in the next month or so, again, to talk to policymakers and talk to industry about what the opportunities are for that ecosystem.
Great, thank you, Michael. Rachel, can I turn to you? As part of the Research and Development Hub, we just heard Alison mention some of the key areas there. It doesn't just cover mapping, which I'd like to get to later, but it covers downstream processing and innovation in that regard as well. How important is it in Geoscience, Australia's work, to position itself that it's working as part of that international ecosystem and is feeding into the requirements and partnerships elsewhere in the globe?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess a lot of the discussions that happen in these forums and with my colleagues here are often around that trade and investment and diversifying supply chains. But a lot of that work is underpinned by some of the technical challenges, and that's where the science organisations of our respective countries, so here in Australia we have Geoscience Australia, the CSIRO and ANSTO, we work very closely to support our policy colleagues when they go overseas and discuss, I guess, one of the examples Alison brought up is around, provenance and traceability. The standards and the policies that are going to underpin that, they need to be, in a global sense, agreed. We need to have a standard way of undertaking provenance and traceability, but it's a challenge at the moment because we don't actually know what that technical solution might look like. You know, is it a geochemical fingerprinting? Is it blockchain, or a combination? But that's where our organizations, so at CSIRO, so GA, and also in the US with the USGS, and I guess as well the National Science Foundation, we are working collaboratively to understand, you know, what does that technical solution look like? Because it needs to be implemented across all of our respective nations, but it also needs to be verified and audited. So how does that look like? So there needs to be a replicable process. So from a technical perspective, there are various policy standards that are implemented, but we need to make sure that we have that knowledge and understanding of what the technical solution looks like.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Ben, and from the UK perspective, obviously Maria, you know, explained that as the mining sector goes back to the Bronze Age, but it's perhaps there's less coming out of the ground these days than there was even 50 years ago or 100 years ago. How is the UK positioning itself to be a player in this global partnership?
Thanks. Yeah, there are, you know, pockets of mineral wealth in the UK that we're now working to map, and there are companies working to extract them. There's an interesting Australian company, actually Aberdeen Minerals, that's looking at some deposits of nickel copper near Aberdeen in Scotland. And I think the thing that the UK strategy does is it acknowledges that, you know, we're smaller as an economy and as a country. We'll have, but our demand for critical minerals will continue to grow. You saw the automotive sector stats, and you know, we don't have hundreds of billions in subsidies to reshape international markets, welcome as they are, because it provides more choice for UK companies and for indeed Australian producers to sell into. We are trying to, I suppose, sweat the existing assets we have. There's a lot of legacy infrastructure around oil and gas up in Scotland, which means that Aberdeen Minerals don't have to build a load of new infrastructure. They can take advantage of an excellent, world-class deep water port facilities there. You heard Maria mention Green Lithium, who are here, probably in the audience somewhere. There's also Tees Valley Lithium building a refinery on the same site. It's a free port. There are incentives for if you want to set up there. World's second largest offshore wind, installed offshore wind, so you can plug in your renewables and sell that to investors as a story as well. And then finally, the sort of third pillar, I suppose, is on leveraging the City of London as a global centre of mining finance. So still, I think most of the world's listed mining companies, but dependent on country, in London, still a great place to raise, explore dual listing if you're a mining company in the audience. So it's those kind of specific assets and strengths of the UK that we're looking to leverage with targeted funding to help companies unlock those.
Great, thanks, Ben. Rachel, I want to come back to you because much of the discussion Ben's mentioned there, funding both in public and private markets. Michael mentioned funding that comes out of the Inflation Reduction Act. But much of your work at Geoscience Australia is away from the funding aspect and providing that bridge. What we don't talk about a lot in the Australian US relationship, and indeed the Australian-UK relationship, is the fundamental geoscience work that you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about the Critical Minerals Mapping Initiative and partnership with the US, and also your collaborations with the UK as well?
Yeah, definitely. So the Critical Minerals Mapping Initiative was established in 2019. It's actually a geoscientific collaboration between Geoscience Australia, the USGS, but also the Geological Survey of Canada, because the USGS and Geological Survey of Canada obviously have had quite a number of close working relationships since they share a geological border. But it was established in 2019, and I guess the major objective of the Critical Minerals Mapping Initiative, or CIMI, was to, first of all, understand what is our, better understand our known critical minerals resources. So, 2019, before COVID, we even started thinking about critical minerals and supply chains and what does that look like. And it was all exaggerated, I guess, or made much more apparent globally through the COVID pandemic. But we just wanted to know what was our known critical minerals resources. And then that was brought, furthered into, okay, we have all of these different deposit types across our three nations. But we wanted to understand what was the critical minerals contents within those deposits, Really good example, all three nations have zinc deposits, and we all mine zinc. And zinc is a really important commodity, not just for the primary commodity of zinc, but also it's an important deposit because it hosts a lot of byproduct critical minerals. So germanium and gallium, and indium in particular, are byproducts that are produced from zinc ores, but they're all created differently. So the zinc ores in Canada, the zinc ores in the US, the zinc ores in Australia, they're created under very different geological conditions, and there's expertise in each of the scientific organizations that have been for decades trying to understand the depositional conditions of these zinc deposits. And because they're created differently, we're able to then share that expertise and actually understand what are the unique factors in each of those deposits that might lead to the accumulation of some kinds of byproducts. That knowledge for for Australia, we know a lot about our zinc deposits, for example, up in MacArthur River. But, we can share that knowledge with our colleagues in the US, and they can likewise share their knowledge with us. And then we're able to apply that knowledge that they have, that expertise, and see, is there a opportunity for us to actually use a different way of thinking or this new learning to apply it to the understanding of our deposits? And does that mean that we're then able to better predict or predictively map where we might be able to find some of these byproducts? And then all of this was combined into, we actually created the largest geochemical database, the Critical Minerals in Ores geochemical database, which actually combines the data and knowledge from all three nations into one publicly accessible database where you can download that data and use it to, understand, what type of ores contain what critical minerals. And all of this is brought together, to try and accelerate the discovery of new critical minerals deposits in our respective nations. Really interestingly, one of the, first, it sounds a bit inconsequential, but it's actually really important. So when we were compiling the Critical Minerals and Ores database, we discovered that each of the nations, we used different terminology for deposit types and depositional environments. Like, there was not a consistent terminology. So how can you make comparisons, or how can you understand the or investigations into the data if there isn't a consistent way of classifying it? So one of the very first things that we did as part of the CIMI initiative was to develop a mineral system classification scheme, which now means that across all three, it's 2 continents pretty much, North America, Canada, Australia, we now have a consistent way of naming our deposits and being able to compare deposits, which is a great first start to being able to do these detailed investigations. With regard to the UK, while we don't have a formal arrangement like CITMI with the British Geological Survey, Geoscience Australia has a long history of working collaboratively or working with the BGS, not only from on a science, science project collaboration, but also there is a lot of, I myself am British, but I work at Geoscience Australia now. There is a huge amount of, shared knowledge between our countries, between the UK and Australia. There's been a lot of movement back and forth between the nations, which helps create those person-to-person connections. So while it's not always a formal agreement, there is a lot of collaboration and knowledge sharing that happens just through conferences like this, where you meet colleagues. Or we have a colleague from Geoscience Australia who's currently in Europe going to the European Geological Survey. There's a big conference in Vienna, and he will undoubtedly meet many of our British colleagues there and discuss with them. So there is, while there's not always a formal arrangement, there's still lots of collaboration and knowledge sharing that happens through just organic person-to-person contacts.
Thanks, Rachel. I should point out that the British aren't trying to take over the Australian sector either as geology scientists or panel chairs. Michael, it strikes me listening to Rachel's comments there about really trying to map the critical minerals at the most extreme upstream of the sector, when it's still in the ground, when it's still formed in the deposit, all the way down to, we're talking about how midstream, downstream, and indeed end product. In your investigation into the sector and your discussions with colleagues here in Australia and back in the US and indeed in Britain, where is the most work needed to build this resilience in this supply chain, in this complicated and convoluted supply chain?
That's one of the things that we're actually working on. We're trying to map the supply chain under the partnership of the Mineral Security Partnership. We're taking the supply chain for electric vehicle batteries as kind of a test case and just mapping that out and looking for those choke points and trying to identify them. So broadly, I think the consensus from the US government is that the major sticking point really is in the processing side of things, as was mentioned earlier. If you look at lithium, how much of Australian lithium is going to the PRC for processing. I think one of the things that the pandemic taught us about global supply chains is that we need to have a lot of diversity and we need to have redundancy, because you never know what's going to happen, whether it's going to be a man-made disaster or a natural disaster that can disrupt those supply chains. And as we go further down the road for the clean energy transition, our economies and our national security are going to become ever more reliant on these technologies and on these inputs. So it makes sense now for the US, for Australia, for the UK, for like-minded countries to try to get together and look at ways of de-risking, diversifying, and creating redundancy in the global supply chains. And also to make sure that people don't just look at price as the only factor when they're looking at accessing resources, that they actually look at, take a longer term view. I'm sure one of the big issues at this conference this year has been the volatility in certain commodity prices. That's just kind of a function, right, of commodities. And you need to think about the long-term horizon, about having long-term partnerships. And one of the things that the US is working on with Australia and with other countries like the UK internationally is try to come up with a standard where we can say, okay, these commodities have been mined with high ESG standards, they've been processed with high ESG standards, therefore, hopefully, industry and ultimately the consumer is willing to pay a little bit more for that. And in addition, they are helping to diversify these supply chains so that there's less risk for disruption in the future.
Thanks, Michael. I'll stay with you because you mentioned the Mineral Security Partnership, and it feels like it's really gathered momentum in the last 6 to 12 months. There was a meeting at the PDSC conference in Toronto. There was many references to it at the Mining Indaba in Cape Town, the gathering of African governments, and then here this week. Is it going to be robust enough to have an impact on the global scale, do you think?
I think definitely. I mean, we're in early days, right? If you want to draw a parallel between the MSP and, say, the International Energy Agency, which also came out of some of turmoil in global commodity markets, that came out of the 1973 oil embargo, and as a result, now we have so much greater cooperation among like-minded consumer and producer countries. We have more transparency in the market. We also have this concept of industrialized countries having national petroleum reserves of 90 days, so that kind of serves as a buffer to any sort of supply disruption. I think the MSP is also going along that route. As I mentioned, they're looking at mapping different critical supply chains. There's also discussion about should like-minded countries agree to having commodity stockpiles for critical minerals so that they have a bit of a buffer. How do you negotiate having a high standard ESG commodity price that is above what maybe the market price is in the short term, but again gives you higher security? I think that is another thing. I'm very bullish on the MSP. It's currently 14 countries plus the EU. Both the US, Australia, the UK, we're all in it together, as are several other countries. And I think as it kind of hits its stride, you're going to see more and more countries join up, and you're going to see more concrete work done, not just on sharing of data, but looking at co-financing for projects. Because the idea is to set a global standard, but also to mobilize public and private capital in specific projects. And we are definitely going towards that goal.
Thanks, Michael. Ben, does the UK government see the MSP as a framework in which you can achieve the goals that you're looking to achieve?
Yeah, definitely. I think it brings together like-minded countries on a sort of a shared challenge that no one of us can solve on our own. It is sort of specifically focused on specific projects as well as standards, and I think, we can lose sight of the fact that specific projects need support. The challenge with the MSP is that it's a new model of cooperation. We're all like-minded countries who share a sense of the risk, but we have sectors and economies that want to take advantage of the energy transition, so we are ultimately competitors as well on some level. But I'd agree with Michael that having joined some of the working groups looking at specific projects and seen the collaboration and the conversations that have come out of that, it is really a new model of cooperation that will take time to bed in, but I think it will start to bear fruit. I'd also say that it looks at projects all over the place. A project in Australia will have different challenges to a project in another region of the world. And there's sort of work that can be done by governments beyond just ensuring access to finance or, export credit agency collaboration, but using our diplomatic network where, the UK has a pretty sizable diplomatic network in continents like Africa still, and use that network to help engagement with government as well as industry.
I'm glad you mentioned Africa. I am going to open the floor to questions. I've just got so many myself. I'm glad you mentioned Africa, Ben, because here in Australia, in Perth, in fact, we have more than 100 ASX-listed companies exploring for minerals of all sorts on the African continent, but in particular critical minerals. We've had some of the speakers yesterday and more today, in fact. Is there room for collaboration and partnerships between our three countries on the African continent, which is becoming increasingly competitive from an investment and minerals perspective?
Completely. I think a lot of these countries have historically seen their resources leave unprocessed, and there's a growing recognition, I think, from conversations I've had with colleagues based in our posts in Africa that they want to do more value adding in country, and they want sort of new models of economic cooperation to achieve that. And I think a lot of these companies that you mentioned are listed in London as well and benefit from those higher standards that investors there expect. So, and a lot of them work with our UK export finance to ensure those projects receive lower cost financing where there's UK content involved. I might sort of ask if Michael or Rachel have any more on that.
Yeah, Rachel, did you?
I mean, Geoscience Australia, we want to focus on discovery in Australia. But for companies that, if you mentioned there's 100 Australian companies exploring in Africa. I mean, at Geoscience Australia, we provide a wealth of data, tools, information that supports exploration in Australia, but those companies can use those same, not the data, but the actual, I guess, concepts and apply that to their exploration in Africa as well. So while it's not directly applicable, there is still, a tangible way that knowledge. And Australia has a great reputation. Geoscience Australia, in many of our talks, we talk about how Australia is one of the few jurisdictions in the world where exploration currently leads to a net positive benefit. In many places in the world, exploration hasn't been as successful as it has been in Australia. But yes, definitely Australian companies can have great success using the techniques that they apply here to overseas countries as well.
Thanks, Rachel. Michael, obviously there's a number of ASX-listed companies that are building processing facilities for their African projects within the US.
We're very bullish on developing projects in coordination with African partners. Part of that is because there are raw materials, raw resources there. We also see it as a crucial link in the development of the region. And quite frankly, we would much prefer to see companies that already adhere to very high standards get involved in developing that sector at the beginning, rather than making some of the same mistakes that were made in other commodity development, which has led in a large measure, as Ben kind of referenced, to resources just leaving countries, local populations not really benefiting that much. Also, to an extent, the resource curse in a way. So we really feel that working through organizations like the MSP, by creating global standards, we will hopefully allow for a better, more robust, and more sustainable development of the sector through these partnerships with Africa. And I know one of the things we're talking about also in coordination, just bilaterally with Australia, is are there projects in Africa that US and Australian companies could work together to help develop the sector?
Thanks, Michael. I'm sure you'll hear lots about that at the Africa Down Under conference to be held here by Paydirt on the 4th to the 6th of September. Thank you very much. We've got time for a couple of questions or comments from the floor. Hands are going up straight away. We've got one just down the front here, Bazzy, and then one back there. If you could just let us know your name and who you are speaking on behalf of, that would be great.
Thank you, Dom, and thank you, panelists. I'd just like to echo a comment which Ambassador Kennedy made at the start, which was that we can't sacrifice, I hope I get this right, Ambassador, we can't sacrifice ESG standards in our race for economic growth. This is something which, sorry, I should have introduced myself. My name's Roland Chavas. I work at the International Lithium Association. We are the global trade body for the lithium industry. And the lithium industry currently has very high ESG standards, hence my affection for the comment by the ambassador. ESG can't be short-sold. It shouldn't be short-sold. And it's very good to hear the words, particularly from Michael, about the long-term view, sustaining the industry at the high standards. We are facing a global challenge, and it takes global solutions to find the way forward. I'd urge no one to be excluded from that conversation, and to misquote a former American president, if we're going to succeed, then we all need to take a stake, because if we don't, then humanity itself will be the orphan of failure.
Thank you, Roland. We've got a question.
Hello, very interesting. Christy Young is my name. I'm just interested in your view. Is there a global view on recycling? And do you think we need to be smarter from the get-go with how we use these critical minerals they're very difficult to process? And so just interested in your views on that.
Ben, I think you should have that one first.
Yeah, happy to. So a big part of sort of the UK government strategy that I haven't mentioned yet focuses on recycling. There's quite a lot of funding available. Some of the EVs that are being made now will start to need their batteries recycled in probably about 5 to 10 years' time. And there are a growing number of companies looking to do that in the UK. So you can mine these end-use products. And I think in addition to sort of funding R&D in this space, there are a few companies that have spoken here that are working on that. There's Redivium, I think, is a ASX-listed company looking to build a recycling facility in the UK. Ionic, yeah, indeed, looking to recycle some of those offshore wind turbines once they come offline, taking advantage of Belfast Port to do that. So I think it's very much sort of another one of the UK's strengths, and a recognition that you don't necessarily need a huge mine to be able to supply yourself with critical minerals. And final mention just on EU regulation and the role that's playing in this, because their Critical Raw Materials Act will have a ramping up percentage of their supply that needs to be recycled. So if you're a company looking to do that now, you'll find a lot of demand from the EU towards the end of this decade and beyond.
Yes, Rachel.
Yeah, I just want to say as well that, recycling, it's acknowledged by the Australian government that that is also an important aspect of obtaining critical minerals. I just wanted to give a shout out to our CSIRO colleagues who are also working in this space, doing quite a lot of R&D to understand. There's a lot of talk about EV recycling, battery recycling, but maybe not talked about so much is solar panel recycling. Solar panels, solar PVs is going to be a huge aspect of the roll to net zero. Solar panels do have quite a long life, maybe 25 years, but some of those solar panels installed 20 years ago, they're now ready to be recycled, and we don't quite have the technologies to do it. There's a lot of important critical minerals, namely silicon, in the solar panels, and our colleagues at CSIRO are actually working on how can we recycle those.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Michael, did you have some?
Just to note that some of the funding under the IRA is specifically earmarked for recycling of critical minerals, because we see that that is an essential part of the chain, that we shouldn't just be focusing on constantly mining new material, but also making better use of what's already existing.
Great, thank you. And I should point out in the next panel discussion on European critical minerals projects, we'll have representatives from Neometals who are building a recycling lithium-ion battery recycling facility in Germany. We've got time for one more question. We've just got one down the front here from Alistair.
Hi, I've got two questions, but one I'll take up with you afterwards because it won't be a pleasant conversation. I hate to be a prickle in the room. It's about the UK export finance and how they won't finance products manufactured in their own country for us. But the question I've got is, which African country is part of the MSB or is looking to be a part of the MSB membership, if it's that important?
I'm happy to talk about UK export finance. They do have quite sort of narrow mandate they operate in, which is set in legislation. So whilst they're very keen to support critical minerals projects, they're sort of hampered by that, but I'm very happy to talk to you afterwards. On the MSP, I'm not up to date with the ongoing sort of conversations about admitting new members, but you might have seen the EU had a proposal for a EU critical raw materials club, sort of a buyers club of, and I think one of their ambitions with that was to try and bring in more producer companies from developing countries, particularly African countries. And now I think there's been a recognition that a lot of those objectives were aligned with the MSP. So you might have seen announcements recently of an MSP forum, which is kind of merging those two ideas. And so I imagine as part of that, the plans will be to engage more African states and involve them in those discussions.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Ben, for that answer. Unfortunately, I've got the red numbers of death screaming at us here that we've run over time, so we're going to have to call that an end of the session. But can I just ask you to join me in thanking our panellists, Ben, Rachel and Michael. Thank you very much.